Awesome, awesome. Well, so we'll go ahead and call the school board meeting to order now at this time. And of course, board members and Mr. Chambers, I see you're sitting in for Ms. Jackson. We'll do the usual. We'll move through each item on the agenda and see how things go. Of course, the first item is to approve the agenda and any changes that we have, and I'm showing no changes in front of me tonight to the agenda.
Move it.
Motion by Mr. Walker.
I'll second that.
Second by Mr. Destin. All in favor, let's vote. The vote is 5-0. All right, we're showing no recognitions tonight. We're showing no visitors, but we do have an individual here to make public comment, and that would be Mr. Gene Early. Mr. Early, would you come forward, please? And I think you are pretty familiar with the procedure.
Yes, sir.
Mr. McInnes, y'all know you'll provide some direction.
4 minutes, Mr.
Yes, sir.
All right, 4 minutes, and Mr. Early, you've got the floor.
Thank you, appreciate it. Last meeting, y'all were discussing the contract for the investigator. If you go back 2 months ago, we discussed the new school board, or excuse me, the school district HR investigator policy. When we discussed that, we were also discussing the contract then. I came before you and I was told not to worry, we would not issue a contract before we had the Okaloosa County School District School Board policy. Is that still the same, or is something changing? Because y'all interchanged school processes and procedures with policy the entire last meeting. I was confused by the end of y'all's discussion.
Mr. McInnes, would you like to speak to that, sir?
Yes, sir. We did talk about before the contract would be entered into, what the district has adopted and brought to the board are the investigative procedures.
Yes, sir.
And those are in place now. And in fact, the contract the board approved specifically had language added that required that investigator to comply with those procedures in his work.
Okay, the night I came forward, you said the policy, your policy, would be approved before the contract was issued. And there's a reason for that. If you go back and look at the September 14 video that y'all had last year of y'all's workshop, you'll see that it was stressed that during the investigation, y'all's policies and procedures were thoroughly and completely followed. That's what got me involved with y'all, because y'all had no policies and no procedures. If the school board doesn't have a policy, then the district doesn't have to follow it. The district can do whatever they want to with their procedures because they're not your procedures. That's why I'm asking again, are you going to pass a school board policy before you enter in a contract with this? Because one of your members told me point blank, you get what you pay for. And if you don't have good requirements in the front of it and something that people are accountable for, once again, you get what you pay for. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Early. Mr. Destin, please stay there, because there may be questions.
The question is, Board Attorney, have we adopted the investigative procedures as a policy?
No, sir, they were not adopted as policy. We discussed the fact they were going to be procedures. It will allow the district staff to come back to you with changes which can be made more quickly and efficiently. If it's in a policy, it's going to take a much longer period of time to make those kind of adjustments. Also, you have readopted revisions to your policies on the equity investigations and complaints, and also now a thorough policy on just general employee complaints. Both of those board policies direct processes for investigation, not as thorough as the procedure, but they do direct investigative procedure, and then these procedures are used now with those in that event. So that, and if you'll remember, when the service agreement was being considered, I think Mr. Destin, maybe you specifically said, are the investigative procedures, or whatever words you used, in this contract, and we went back and added that language to the contract to require that to be followed.
Okay, I guess the only question I have then is, if it's not a policy, what are the sanctions for not following it? Are the sanctions more severe if it is a policy? I understand your explanation that it's harder to change if it's in policy form.
Sure. The policy is a board adopted directive. The procedures are brought here for board review. They're implemented by the superintendent. I think a violation of either one, could be dealt with, but I'm not going to say that policy is not a more stringent regulation. Certainly it is than procedure.
Well, in that case, I think we probably should adopt it as a policy as soon as possible.
All right, so.
Any opinion?
Yes, sir. Well, just to follow up then, I certainly understand, having been at the school level, the difference between guidelines and procedures and policy. And I remember at the school level, as it may be the case in a department, in the case of HR, that it is much easier to amend or adjust guidelines than it would be to go before the school board and attempt to change the policy. And Mr. McInnes, can you say that we should adopt this in the case that is being presented to us as policy? Roughly, how long does it take us to amend a policy if we go through all the guidelines, advertising, et cetera, to make a change?
We bring it first to you for permission to advertise. Then we run an ad for a 28-day window, and so depending on how the meetings fall, we would then schedule the public hearing after that. So it typically, by the time it's prepared, brought here for first approval to advertise, and then we'd probably be looking at, I'm just going to guess, 45 days, something like that.
That's the number that I've heard, typically 45 days. So should HR determine that they need to make an adjustment in their guidelines or their policy that then became school board policy, if I understood you correctly, it would take them 45 days to do that.
Yes, well, I'm saying roughly, yes, sir. The advertising period is a 28-day window, and then depending on where the meetings fall, we schedule the meeting after that. So that's how you'd get to roughly 45 days.
All right. So, Mr. Destin, I didn't mean to step in.
Quite right. You
but
clarified helpfully.
So I wanted to put that out there so that should there be a motion to codify this in policy, we're prepared to do that.
And we understand how long it takes to change it.
Okay. So I will entertain a motion to place this into policy if there's a board member that would like to do that.
Before we entertain a motion, can I ask Mr. McInnes a question?
Sure.
Typically, we don't have a board policy for every procedure that the district uses, correct?
That's correct.
We have numerous procedures, and when we have employees who, for whatever reason, might not follow a procedure, how would that be handled by the superintendent's office?
Well, it could be a matter of complaint and discipline.
Correct.
If it's established adopted procedure.
Well, the most important thing was procedure policies where we abide by them and follow them. That's the most important thing. And the big thing is the way I've always understood it is basically until you turn it into a policy, the procedure rests, most responsibility rests for the superintendent. When you go to the policy, then the board.
That's right.
And that's really the whole text of
That's
where
right,
you
sir.
want to deal with it. Do you want to leave part of the board's authority with the superintendent, or do you want to shift it to the board?
I understand.
And
I
that's
think
it.
that's Mr. Early's point.
That's
Yes, sir.
it.
My point is that when y'all had your discussion on the board, we're going back 4 months now, for the next 2 months after that, it was y'all's discussion that it would be a policy, a procedure, and a contract if y'all discuss these issues. Working with y'all and everything else, I fully understand what's in the current procedures, and to be honest with you, they're good, but y'all need to put some teeth in it, and y'all need to put some board oversight into that, which is what I thought y'all were going for all along. Now, I understand that this is it's a fluid thing. It really is. And when you start working with your contracts and your RFPs and everything else, you can very easily get ahead of the horse with that cart, and I think y'all have done it. So if you would, I'd greatly appreciate y'all taking a look at that. I mean, if you only go back and check what was said,
Right.
But from my position, I think y'all need a policy. I do not think those procedures that were hammered out covers what y'all need to have for y'all's authority with the school district.
For compliance.
Yes, sir.
I get it.
Thank you very much.
All right, Mr. Early. Anything else, board members?
Mr. McInnes,
Yes, ma'am.
when we created the investigation procedures, we used the Florida Department of Education's guidelines for investigations. which.
We used a number of resources in pulling it together, but that was part of it, yes.
Right.
Including Mr. Early, if I remember
Yes.
correctly.
uh-huh.
Anything else?
And I mean, to my knowledge, there hasn't been a recommendation from other entities regarding policies for all procedures, or particularly for investigation procedures.
I'm
Well, no authority, like in the research that you guys referred to or referenced in creating the procedures, the investigative procedures, were there any references that made recommendations for policies to be created in regards to those investigative procedures?
Just Thrush, off the top of my head, I don't remember a specific recommendation to that. I mean, the HR staff had pulled together a number of different resources, and those all were kind of looked at, melded together, and we did meet with Mr. Early and went through that and used some of his expertise there. But I can't tell you that I remember a specific documented recommendation for that.
Okay.
Well, I guess in just following up on your point, Ms. Thrush, Mr. Early, I wrote down the date of that meeting. Should we review that video, and should we take in consideration the public comment? I guess we could come back at a later meeting and propose at
May I
this
make
meeting.
a suggestion?
Sure. Yeah, sure.
One thing that you might consider that I think could add, thinking this through, could add some additional authority from the board level.
Okay.
It could be that you could direct that a policy be developed that requires the preparation and adoption of investigative procedures.
Interesting.
And therefore, the board then calls for those procedures to be put in place and to be followed.
Right.
And that way, if the policy allows those to be developed and amended from time to time, they would not be laid out in full in the policy,
Right.
but then the board would have basically blessed
Oversight.
the fact that those procedures are there, and the policy could direct that they be followed.
Well, there's a motion.
Which may give us the best of both worlds in that situation.
Or, Mr. McGinnis, likewise, could we, review our ethics policy, and as part of the ethics policy, I know when I reviewed other ethics policies, when we were updating ours, and I've just pulled up another school districts in Florida's policy. I mean, we can allude to in our ethics policy, which I think we kind of do, as far as falsifying or misrepresenting or not following procedures as a ethics violation or a code of conduct, professional practice violation. That seems more appropriate than adopting a policy for potentially every procedure that we have.
The only thing that I would say that in my mind, these investigative guidelines are unique. And I don't know that because we might choose to adopt a policy as proffered by the attorney, that we would have to do that for every procedure or every guideline. I think it's purely the board's choice.
I agree with that, and you have occasionally adopted policies that do call for certain procedures to be developed, for certain lists to be prepared annually. I mean, there's guidance and direction in other policies you have for different kinds of things that the superintendent and her staff are directed to prepare and update and renew and things like that. So I just offer that as a potential option of a way that you could imprimatur over those procedures.
Well, and of course, we have a public hearing that we're a little bit overdue on.
Right.
But I guess, Mr. Destin, would you like to work with the attorney and then maybe bring that language back, or would you want to do it tonight, or?
I can make a quick motion directing him to adopt the compromise suggestion.
Okay.
And the nice thing about that is we'll have a public hearing, we'll get to read it again. Having been somewhat critical of our travails in the past, it was easy to do when we didn't have a dog in the fight. And I don't think that's fair to the staff. and we need to be on the front lines with them, so we need to adopt something.
So is that your motion?
That's, the motion is to direct Mr. McGinnis to move forward with the
The
policy he just suggested.
All right, so motion by Mr. Destin, looking for a second.
Second.
Second by Mr. Walker. Any further discussion?
Mr. McGinnis, if I understand correctly, we're making a motion this evening without, reviewing the video recording that Mr. Early referred to, without doing any due diligent research. And while I'm not, against what you proposed or necessarily Mr. Destin's motion at the future, I would like more time to, I would prefer, as Dr. White had suggested, that this item come before us at a later agenda once we've had time to do due diligence and research the video that Mr. Early is referencing, and look at other districts and understand legal issues that might play into a policy in regards to investigative procedures.
Well, and if the board would allow, as this draft is put together, we can put together some information for you from other districts to give you an idea of what's happened there. And remember, all we'll be doing is bringing a draft back to the board for permission to advertise. You can rediscuss it at that point, and if you decide not to move forward, you just don't
Well, it can be rejected.
authorize the advertisement, and then we don't do it.
Right.
So it'll have another vetting before it goes to public hearing.
You've had more than your 4 minutes, but I'm going to give you more.
I understand, sir, but this discussion, okay, y'all are the school board,
That's right.
all right? Y'all have had this discussion since November, all right? I'm not telling you anything you don't know, anything you haven't looked at, anything you haven't discussed in the past. These are your words, not mine. But when you tell the public you will have a policy, you will have a procedure before you contract, that's what you should do. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Early. All right, so any further discussion on the motion on the table?
One point,
Yes, sir.
Mr. McGinnis, if we do a policy, the contract would be subject to it, whether it was done before or after, would it not?
Yes, sir.
Okay. So we're just talking about,
That contract has not been signed yet,
yeah,
so that can be taken care of.
okay.
Ex post facto.
Well,
Go ahead.
in regards to that question and then your response, so would we delay, we've already approved that contract.
That's correct. With
So
certain
we-
revisions that are being made to it now.
Right, but if we're going to wait till a policy is approved, then if we need to use services under that contract, we can't.
Well, the policy, the contract you approved requires compliance with those procedures. The policy you would be adopting is simply
Reinforcement.
authorizing those procedures. And so since the contract already called for those procedures to be complied with, the fact that you adopt the policy is just going to reinforce that. I don't think it makes the contract any less effective because the procedures are in fact there.
And my concern was more that it wouldn't delay that contract being signed in case there was a need to use that contract for an upcoming investigation.
No, ma'am, I think that's certainly, we take our direction from the board in that regard. If you were comfortable with the fact that it's, you directed that the reference to the procedures be put in there, and that's been done. And what I'm saying is that this policy, once it's adopted, reinforces those procedures. But we can follow your guidance on that, however you'd like to do that.
Any further discussion on the motion?
I just want to make
Yes,
sure
sir.
I'm clear what I'm hearing here. So tonight, if I choose to vote in favor with Mr. Destin, this is just allowing us to move forward with it, but not actually implementing a
right.
policy, correct?
Yes, sir.
Okay.
We'll get another bite at the apple later.
Okay.
Correct?
Yes, sir.
All right, so I guess if there's no more discussion, let's vote. All in favor? All opposed? All right, carries 5-0. All right, Mr. McInnes, thanks for the suggestion too, by the way. All right, so we're scheduled, board members, to have a public hearing. Let's go ahead and call that into session. Then I'm going to recess it very quickly, if I can get the thing down there to, all right, it is labeled
Item
16.1.
Yes, sir.
Right, 16.1. So I'll call the public hearing 16.1 into session. I'll recess the public hearing, call us back into regular session so we can proceed with our agenda and not have folks miss their dinner arrangements. All right, so we are now back to Section 6, Administrative Personnel Appointments. And Mr. Chambers, you're going to be appointing an Assistant Principal 1 for Choctawhatchee High School. And with that, I'm going to pass the gavel to Mr. Destin.
Absolutely.
Mr. Destin?
Yes, sir.
Ms. Bowell, if you would come up here, please.
I see a lot of green out there in the audience.
And I would like to say on behalf of Mrs. Jackson, she'll be recommending Ms. Bowell for the assistant principal job at Choctawhatchee, and want to read her bio.
Okay, sure.
Melissa Bowell has been the secondary curriculum specialist for Okaloosa County Schools since 2015. Melissa has deep roots in Okaloosa County Schools, as her mother retired from teaching after 35 years. Her sister Heather is a mental health counselor, and her husband David is a school resource officer at Niceville High School. She has been an educator here in Okaloosa County for 17 years. She began her career teaching English language arts at Fort Walton Beach High School.
Hey, I worked there too one time.
Where she taught 9th and 10th grade ELA, and she also taught AP Literature until 2013, when she became a teacher on special assignment in curriculum and instruction. While Melissa is extremely proud of the work she did in the classroom with students, working with teachers has provided her even more professional joy over the last 5 years. Melissa graduated from Florida State University with her bachelor's in English Literature and the University of West Florida with her master's degree in curriculum and a specialist in ed leadership. Having presented professional development at Choctaw over the last 5 years, Melissa is ecstatic to join the rest of the Big Green Indians at Choctaw and is humbled by the tradition of excellence there. Melissa and David have 2 daughters, Madeline, a freshman at Choctaw, and Abigail, a 6th grader at Meigs Middle School. And we are pleased to present Ms. Bowell to you.
And Mr. Destin, might I be recognized?
Yes, sir. Please make the motion.
I make the motion for the appointment of Ms. Bowell.
And I'll second it.
All right. Any discussion? We'll call the vote. 5-0.
Congratulations.
Dr. White, would you like to
Congratulations.
join us up here?
I just want to say thank you to the superintendent and her fill-in, as well as you guys and Dr. Hale for this exciting opportunity. I promised myself no tears, so I already broke that one. I'm super humbled, and I would be remiss if I didn't thank my curriculum family for teaching me what true leadership is, so thank you. I'm excited. I really am. These are tears of joy, I promise.
If family wants to come forward, you want to call them forward?
Yeah, come on.
You have to do it.
Call to duty.
Figured you'd do that.
Yeah, you can't do that when you're 18. You'll want to.
Like new job, who this?
Come on in, y'all get up in front. I'll
I'm
go in the back.
hide
I'm good
because
in
I'm
the
not
back.
in green.
I'm good in the back. I'm good in the back. Background.
Holy moly, was a big green Indian.
Indeed.
We're going to take a couple, so keep smiling. Okay, ready? He's so cute with his
Thank you.
You're coming to Chicago too.
But I'm trying.
I will officially pass the gavel back to the chairman.
Thank you. All right, folks, so what we'll do is I'm going to call a 1.5-minute recess for anybody that wants to head out to dinner or whatever it might be. We'll reconvene here in a minute.
That was too cool. That's correct.
All right, so let's go ahead and call us back into session. And board members, let's move back down to the public hearing, 16.1. I'll recess the regular meeting, call us into session on the public hearing. And let me read what it says, and then we'll go from there. Revised job description for delivery personnel, school food service, presented by Ms. Lindsay Maxey, Specialist, Human Resources, and recommended by the Superintendent for approval. Is there anyone here tonight to speak to the matter of the public hearing? All right, Mr. McInnes, seeing none, board members, I'll entertain a motion. Motion by Mr. Walker.
I'll second.
Second by Ms. Thrush. Any further discussion? Seeing none, let's vote. All in favor? The vote's 5-0. All right. We'll close the public hearing, open the regular meeting, and go back now to committee and staff reports, section 7. We covered those during the workshop. And moving on to consent agenda. So, board members, I am going to ask to move item 8.12 to discussion. Is there any other item that folks would like to move? All right, hearing or seeing none, then at this point, I'm looking for a motion.
Move it.
Motion by Mr. Walker.
Second.
Second by Ms. Thrush. Yes,
Just
sir.
one bit of discussion. The stipend is,
That's the one I moved.
yes, what's the amount?
For the-
15.
15?
And so we'll come back to that one under discussion,
Right, okay.
okay?
Yep, gotcha,
Is that agreeable?
absolutely.
Okay. Anything else on consent? All right, so we got a motion. Let's vote. All in favor? The vote is 5-0. All right, so consent carries. Let's scroll on down. There's another long one because we're getting ready to open school. And then we come to Human Resources Recommendations, Section 9. 9.1, Deferred Retirement Option Program is for information only. 9.2 is the out-of-field report, and this is an action item. So I'm looking for a motion.
So
Move
moved.
it.
That was close.
Mr. Walker can have it.
All right.
Whatever.
Motion by Mr. Walker, second by Mr. Bryant. All in favor, let's vote. Carries 5-0. 9.3, Personnel Recommendations presented by Mr. Chambers, Assistant Superintendent Curriculum. And this is also an action item, so looking for a motion.
I'll move it.
Motion by Ms. Thrush,
Second.
second by Mr. Bryant. Any discussion? Not seeing any. Let's vote. All in favor? Vote carries 5 to, can I see the votes again? It was 5 to 0. Mr. Walker, did you vote, sir? I didn't see.
Yes, I voted.
Okay, you voted for it, right? 5 to 0. All right, 9.4, substitute recommendations for 2018-2019 school year presented by Mr. Chambers. This is also an action item.
I'll move it. I'll
Motion
second
by
it.
Ms. Thrush, second by Mr. Walker. Any discussion? All right, not seeing any, let's vote. All in favor? Votes 5 to 0. 9.5, employment separations presented by Mr. Marcus Chambers, Assistant Superintendent, Curriculum and Instruction, and recommended by the Superintendent for approval.
I'll
Also
move
an
it.
action item.
I'll move it.
Motion by Ms. Thrush,
Second.
second by Mr. Walker. Any discussion? Seeing none, let's vote. All in favor? Votes 5 to 0. 9.6, employee transfers presented by Mr. Marcus Chambers, Assistant Superintendent, Curriculum and Instruction, and recommended by the Superintendent for approval. Also an action item.
Move it.
Motion by Mr. Walker,
Second.
second by Ms. Thrush. Any discussion?
Chairman, I'll make a.
Yes, sir.
I'll make a motion to table.
To table all the employee transfers.
I think there are 5 or 6 there. And would be a motion to table the next meeting.
Table until the next meeting.
Right.
Okay. So we have a motion by Mr. Destin to table the employee transfers. Looking for a second.
I'll second.
Second by Mr. Walker. Okay, so, and here again, we can have discussion about this, but now, Mr. Attorney, I'm going to ask you to give some counsel and direction regarding that discussion regarding these employee
Or
transfers.
make a point of order,
Okay.
Chairman. There is no discussion on a motion
On a motion
to
to
Only-
table.
Not debatable on a motion to
Not
table.
debatable, no
The
discussion.
tabling.
There's no discussion about the tabling motion.
Right.
So if there's a question about tabling the matter, that's not,
I mean, there's
Under Robert's rules,
Not
that's not
debate
allowed.
on
well, and I appreciate that, but now I'm gonna defer to the lawyer.
That's quite all right.
I'm not, if we're not discussing the transfers themselves, but choosing to discuss the tabling motion, there's no discussion
Right,
on
that's
that?
what I'm saying that you don't debate is the tabling motion.
Wow. Well, that's an interesting perplexion, because there may be timelines involved that I don't know. So, then your recommendation then, Mr. Attorney, is to call the question.
Yes, sir.
We've done it many times.
And do you mind if
I
I say
know,
one
but-
thing, Dr. White?
Go ahead, Mr. Chambers.
Do you mind if I look really quickly on the timeline piece, the August school board meeting with transfers with teachers? That's the only thing that's going
That's
through
what
my
I'm
mind.
talking about, but I don't think, I think that might be out of order, Mr. Chambers. Not that I don't want that information. Does that make sense?
Yep.
So, without discussing this matter, I guess let's call the question. All in favor of tabling the transfers? Let's have a show of hands. All in favor? All opposed? All right, the motion is defeated to table, okay? However, we now would need a motion to move forward 9.6. So I'm looking for a motion to move forward item 9.6.
Well, you had a motion and a second already.
We did,
Yes,
and then
sir.
the tabling came after that?
Yes, sir.
Correct.
You had a
So
motion
we're
by
back to
Mr.
the original
Walker,
motion to
second Ms.
approve.
Thrush. So that motion
And that
was-
sequence is proper?
he moved to table the item, so I mean,
Right.
that stopped the
I know that. Okay.
forward movement.
All right, then. Okay, so then, since the original motion and the second stands in the event that the table motion failed, then we can have discussion about 9.6. Any discussion? Any discussion? Well, Mr. Chambers, this might be a good time for me to ask you about those timelines that you proffered earlier. Do you have that information that you could check on?
Do you have the August board meeting date?
Yeah, it's the first, yeah, the
August the
13th.
13th,
The first day of school.
which is the actual first day of school. So the only point that I would make is if, unless we brought this to the July 31st meeting.
Budget?
Budget meeting, where the school board was meeting, if we get to the August 13th meeting, some of these teachers on here would already be, in essence, at their school sites if approved tonight.
All right, how many, and some of these questions I know the answer to, I think. How many folks are on this transfer list?
6.
4 teachers.
4 teachers, okay.
And two non-instructional staff.
Right, 2 non, and so because of the way that we do these, we do them in bulk as opposed to individually. So.
And the non-instructional are ESE paraprofessionals, so
And one-on-one, which is
a requirement.
critical.
Well, but we have added items to the budget meeting. We've in fact done it for this one coming forward. Board members, you understand what I'm saying?
It's a special meeting. It's advertised as a meeting. It's not a workshop, so.
Right, and we've added items to that.
Right.
Chairman, if it'll make you more comfortable, I'll offer a substitute motion to move this item to that finance meeting.
So that we can get those people in place.
Exactly.
And since we couldn't discuss that when it was tabled, that clarification has helped me now. So motion by Mr. Destin to move it to the
Budget
July 31 budget meeting. Is that correct? That
Yes.
date correct, 31?
I think it is.
And
Is that
folks, you
correct?
can see because of the sunshine law, we don't talk about any of these things. And so sometimes this discussion's a little clumsy because we're trying to understand exactly what everyone is saying so that we all understand what we're voting about because we've not talked about or considered any of this before. So, all right, so we have a motion by Mr. Destin then to move it. Do we have a second?
I'll second.
Second by Mr. Walker. Okay, and this is effective, a tabling motion for the 31st, is that correct?
It would be.
Is it specific now?
Are you amending the motion that's on the table?
I'm offering a substitute motion.
A substitute motion.
But it's a table motion
No,
again?
the table motion's gone.
Okay,
This is
so
the
it's
motion.
not a
already been-
table, it's
no,
just a
That's
motion.
already been voted on.
All right, so we're just,
Okay.
so we can have free discussion then
Yes,
about
sir.
moving this to the 31st.
Yeah, and I see staff is looking a little bit confused or maybe apprehensive.
Wouldn't we have to vote on the original motion that was first and seconded before we vote on an amended motion?
Well, no, I mean, if you were amending or substituting.
He's
you
amending the
vote on that
existing,
before you
he's
vote
not
on the other
making,
motion,
okay.
right.
And since we have a motion and a second.
And you can discuss now.
Is there time for discussion? I guess my concern is if we move this item to the 31st, what's going to transpire between now and then that couldn't have transpired once the board agenda was published last Monday, after the workshop Thursday, and before this evening?
Well, I'm not, I can't answer that question.
I'll tell you what, this
Okay.
is bouncing around, but I'll withdraw the motion, the substitute, and we'll go back to the original one and if appropriate, can pass it.
Okay, so the motion to move it to the 31st is withdrawn.
Yes.
All right. And so we're back to which motion?
The one to approve.
Motion to approve the agenda item.
Any further discussion on the motion to approve?
I hope all of y'all can understand it. I'm done me, I just don't.
No, I don't believe that. I don't believe
I'm
that.
gonna just know one thing, I'm gonna raise my hand to approve whatever in the hell we bring up.
That's like the coach that says, I've got a terrible team. That means you better watch out. I don't believe it. All right, so no more discussion? All right, all in favor, let's vote. All opposed? All right, motion carries 4-1. Okay. All right. Hope these others aren't nearly as complicated. All right, 9.7, employee suspension, presented by Mr. Chambers and recommended by the superintendent. Looking for a motion.
Move it.
Motion by Mr. Walker,
Second that one.
second by Mr. Destin. Any discussion? Seeing none, let's vote. All in favor? The vote is 5-0. 9.8, leave without pay, presented by Mr. Chambers and recommended by the superintendent. Looking for a motion.
Move it.
Motion by Mr. Walker,
Second.
second by Mr. Destin. Any discussion? Hearing or seeing none, let's vote. All in favor? Carries 5-0. All right, discussion agenda, and there is one item that I moved, that is 8.12. Board members, you can refer to your agenda to see what that particular item pertains to. It is a stipend for the assistant superintendent position for additional comprehensive duties, presented by Mrs. Scallon, Chief Financial Officer, and recommended by the superintendent for approval. So, Mr. Destin, I know you had a question about the amount or whatever, so.
That's correct. I know that we all met individually with the staff and the superintendent to discuss the realignment of the HR and construction to move HR up from the community college VOTEC and this stipend. And I couldn't remember exactly what the amount was that we all discussed, or at least that I discussed at that meeting. Do you remember what it was, Rita?
8,000.
8,000 to be.
I thought it was
8,000.
was it 8,000 net or 8,000 gross? I thought it was 11,000.
No, it was $8,000 gross salary or gross stipend to the individual. And then in addition to that would be any corresponding fringe benefits that the district would pay on that, like FICA, retirement, that kind of thing. That was the discussion in the individual meetings, but out of those individual briefings with each board member, there was input from most of those board members that felt like $8,000 was not an appropriate amount.
Well, now, Ms. Scallon, I don't mean to interrupt you, ma'am, but I think we may have had some discussion about this at the budget workshop.
Yes, we did that too.
All right, and so maybe, I don't know about
We did.
independent discussions that were held,
Right.
but I know specifically because I wasn't able to attend most of that meeting, and I have the DVDs. And
Yes.
I've watched them, even though those aren't out there for the public, I've watched them, and there was specific discussion about the amount of this stipend in that budget workshop.
There was, and then there was also input
Well, maybe,
from some board members there were.
right. Okay.
Yeah, and as I remember, there was discussion, although I don't know, since it's a workshop, we could not vote to set a figure.
That's correct, and so that is why it is on the agenda for your approval, because I cannot authorize to pay that stipend or to move forward on that unless I have appropriate board action, and so that is why I agended the item.
It is. I understand.
All right, any further questions about it or comment?
Do we have a motion?
Well, no, I mean, I've got I guess a comment to say. And
Shouldn't we have a
I need to have a
motion?
motion before
I'm
we
sorry,
start.
I'm
debate.
sorry, excuse me. You're exactly right. I just followed up with a question from Mr. Destin. So, need a motion to approve the recommendation of the superintendent.
I'll make a motion to approve the superintendent's recommendation.
Motion by Ms. Thrush.
I'll second it.
Second by Mr. Bryant.
And that is for,
The amount listed,
8.1.
$15,000.
most people can't see our screen in front of us, right?
I
Right.
understand, right.
But
All
they-
right, so now it's
It
appropriate.
is on the agenda, listed the
Right.
dollar amount.
Right. So now it's appropriate for discussion. And so what I guess my thinking is that, just my opinion, it's a tall order to ask a man or a woman to fulfill the duties of what heretofore has always been two separate jobs. I think the budget record reflects that we've always funded two separate positions. I think the record would reflect that as long as I can remember, we've had two separate positions. And so I have the highest regard for the personnel that's involved in this and their competence. That is not the issue. The issue in my mind is that we've always had two full-time positions for this job, both of these jobs, that being curriculum and also for HR. So because of that, I'll be voting against this motion. Any further discussion?
I'll have just a little. I agree with you that it needs two heads. We need one for HR and one for curriculum. And I see this in the best case scenario as a temporary solution. And in fact, I think if I recall in the budget that we were going to be looking at, it does have those positions budgeted in so that they can be done without further action by the board. I do believe that Mr. Chambers has worked very hard, and if it lasts for another 3 or 4 months, I would like to see him get a little something extra. So I'm going to offer a substitute motion that his stipend be $11,000 rather than $15,000.
All right, so we have a motion on the floor to reduce the stipend from 15 to 11.
That would be an amendment to the motion that's on the
Amendment,
floor.
okay. So looking for a second to the amendment.
Well, if we don't go that direction and look at the time frame, to me, it would be better to, because I was under the impression, because of the reasons given by the staff, that we had had very limited applications for the job. And I think you all, and I was wholeheartedly supported the move we made to do this on a temporary basis, simply because giving us more time to make sure that we had a good number of good applicants to apply for the job. And truthfully, I have no problem, and I'm going to support the stipend for the $15,000 if it comes to that vote. However, if we wanted to move to Mr. Destin's moving to the $11,000, but the way we do it, we would just set it up, and I'm supporting the 15. We'll set it up on a monthly type basis to where if we replace the thing in 6 months, then naturally we would discontinue the stipend. And to me, that would be the best way to handle it. It might be that if the superintendent and her staff decided to come back within 3 months and decide that we wanted to advertise and go ahead and fill the position, then the stipend will be even less. However, if kind of the way I understood it, we probably was going to be at least several months and possibly the whole year before we fill this position. So I'll either support the $15,000 or either support some type of motion to where we would give Mr. Chambers the amount of $15,000 on a monthly basis. And that otherwise, to me, it'd be the same amount. And Ms. Scalia may have to tell us if that's even possible to do that or not. I don't know where you could break the stipend down, that if he was there doing the double duty for 3 months, he'd receive that amount of money. If he was there 6 months, and it would vary depending on length of service. And that would be what I would recommend if we was concerned about the amount.
Ms. Gallant,
Yes.
thanks for coming back to the podium.
And I wanted to clarify and wanted clarification from y'all, but the $15,000 stipend was for the entire year. And as we discussed at the budget workshops, that in the event that the position were filled 3 months. The 15,000 is prorated over the
Be
12-month
prorated,
period. So
right.
if it's 3 months, then he would only get 3 months worth of the 15,000, or 6 months, or however many months he fulfilled that
Right.
position. So when the 11,000 was mentioned, I wanted to make sure that we were clear on.
That would apply to that also, I suppose, should 11,000
You did it
prevail.
annually, but you had mentioned 3 or 4 months. So I
Mhm.
wasn't sure.
All right, so I think we have an amendment.
Don't have a second yet.
That's what I'm looking for. Looking for a second to Mr. Destin's amendment to compromise. Split the difference between the 8,000 and the 15,000, I guess. Looking for a second. Hearing no second, then the amendment fails. So we go back to the original motion, which is on the table, to approve the stipend of $15,000 for
I move it.
double duty.
It's already.
It's already
There's
moved
already
and
got a
seconded.
motion.
We've got
Second.
it. We've got
Been
it.
seconded?
Yes, sir. Yes, sir. We're
Okay,
good,
let's
Mr.
vote.
Walker. Yep. Any more discussion? Okay. All in favor? 3. All opposed? 2. Motion carries 3-2. All right. Very good. All right. Moving on to construction program owners representatives business. That's Mr. Walker. Mr. Walker, what you got?
Nothing, just as we discussed at the workshop, Attorney Miskalian's working on all that, and we'll try to get it to you as quickly as we can.
Okay.
On the contract.
All right. Thank you, sir. And then moving on to Section 12, Information Technology Seat Management Contract, 12.1, CACI Task Order Number 2-103, Revision 1-5, Salto Doors at Blue Water Elementary School, presented by Mr. Dustin Keith, Specialist Seat Management, and recommended by the Superintendent for approval.
I'll move it.
Motion by Ms. Thrush,
Second.
second by Mr. Walker. Any discussion? Not seeing any. Let's vote. All in favor? Votes 5-0. 12.2, CACI Task Order Number 2-106, Revision 1, AI Phone Intercom at Blue Water Elementary, presented by Mr. Dustin Keith, Specialist Seat Management, and approved by the Superintendent for approval.
I'll move it.
Motion by Ms. Thrush,
Second.
second by Mr. Walker. Any discussion? All in favor? Motion carries 5-0. 12.3, CACI Task Order Number 2-108 for mini retrofit at Okaloosa Technical College, Choice High School, presented by Mr. Dustin Keith, Specialist, Seat Management, and recommended by the Superintendent for approval.
I'll move it. I'll
Motion by
second
Ms.
it.
Thrush, second by Mr. Walker. Any discussion? Seeing none, let's vote. All in favor? Votes 5-0. 12.4, CACI Task Order Number 2-109 for the addition of 9 doors to the Salto system at Okaloosa Technical College Choice High School, presented by Mr. Dustin Keith, Specialist, Seat Management, and recommended by the Superintendent for approval.
I'll move it. Or second it.
Motion by Mr. Walker, second by Ms. Thrush. Any discussion? Seeing or hearing none, let's vote. All in favor? Votes 5-0. 12.5, CACI Task Order Number 2-111 for CCTV repair at Antioch Elementary, presented by Mr. Dustin Keith, Specialist, Seat Management, and recommended by the Superintendent for approval.
I'll move it.
Motion by Ms. Thrush,
I'll second.
second by Mr. Bryant. Any discussion? Seeing none, let's vote. All in favor? Votes 5-0. All right, and so we've got our public hearing. So, Mr. McInnes, sir, it's your business.
No report tonight.
All right, thank you. And Mr. Chambers, who's filling in, as I heard, for the superintendent, your business, sir.
Nothing tonight.
All right. Board members' announcements and information requests. And so I'll start with Mr. Walker. Mr. Walker.
Not a thing.
All right, sir. Mr. Destin.
Chairman, at the workshop last week, I requested some information on the modifications we're making to move HR up here. I requested any drawings or plans and a cost estimate. I've still not gotten that. Mr. Chambers, is that underway?
It is.
And the projected completion date for that project is, do we
We
have
are-
one?
We do not have a projected completion date. We have some preliminary moves that we're looking at right now. We're waiting on a drawing sketch for what this room over here could look like, and once we get that with the associated price, then we'll get that to you.
Okay, well, my only fear is that we'll be through with the project before we get the estimated price, which makes it kind of irrelevant.
Well, I assure you, we would not move forward without getting you that information.
And I appreciate that. On another subject related, when, I've done a number of demolitions in my business over the years, and they always required that I had an asbestos report. Are we doing that? Is it required in this situation?
Mr. Koutsaradis?
Or survey, I think they call it.
Well, we would only do any abatements or if we had asbestos that was disturbed. And so we don't have, right now, we're not disturbing any of the flooring and any of the asbestos. So now if that should happen, we would stop at that point and then bring in the folks for the abatement.
And how do we determine that we have disturbed asbestos without a survey?
You determine it by the flooring, the tiling, and if it's cracked, or then that asbestos becomes friable in the air.
So we're qualified to do an asbestos survey? The district has personnel qualified to do that?
We inspect the site, and if the flooring is intact, then no danger from the asbestos. But if the flooring is not intact, then we have to call in the asbestos folks.
Okay, now I've done a number of these, and oftentimes the flooring doesn't contain asbestos. Oftentimes the putty and
Right.
sometimes it does. And I don't know how we determine that without a qualified asbestos surveyor to look at it.
We've got asbestos in areas throughout the district. If it's not disturbed, then it's not an
Okay,
issue.
well, I'm failing to follow how we determine which material has it and which doesn't without a survey. I see
So-
a staff member in the back that may be able to tell us.
Well, can I
Bill could-
offer
Yes,
just a
sir.
little input too? And I don't know how it is that we're addressing the question, except that I remember that every facility used to have, I called it the black book because the cover was black.
Right.
And in that book, it clearly delineated where hazardous material, i.e. RE, asbestos, was located. And so at the school level, for example, if it was, say for example, that the asbestos was in tile underneath carpet, and we were going to replace the carpet, and the carpet had to be removed, we knew that we couldn't do that because when we pull the carpet off, it might make the asbestos in the tile friable.
And when that happens, the contractor stops immediately and calls folks.
Okay.
Calls us.
But I think Mr. Destin's question would be, I guess, do we have such a book for this facility?
We do.
Do we know where the asbestos is or the hazardous materials? And anything that we're doing to this facility, construction-wise, demolition-wise, have we verified that we're not impinging or impeding on any of those asbestos-related materials?
Okay. To my knowledge, at this time, I'm not aware of any asbestos being disturbed.
Okay. Go
And
ahead.
if I could just respond, I think what we're discussing here is getting rough estimate quotes of what it would cost to transfer employees that have been dispersed throughout the district and possibly remaining employees at Lowry Place. My understanding of the way things have proceeded in the past is then if the board approves for the superintendent and directs the superintendent and staff to go out and obtain bids or time and materials, depending on what's being recommended, that's when an assessment occurs. When you write the bid, it could be written to include, any possibility of asbestos abatement, or that's when those respondents might request information in regards to those buildings, and then receive that and then respond accordingly. If that's my understanding of how things have proceeded in the past, that what Mr. Destin and the board has requested of the superintendent was just to provide a rough estimate of transferring those employees to a centralized facility. But then once the board receives that rough estimate information, then we would actually go put that out for bid, and a more in-depth cost or plan would be provided to board members to approve or not approve. Is that correct?
And Mr. Destin would be the one to clarify that, so.
Yeah, my question is twofold. One was to get the cost estimate. The other is, we are going to do remodeling, some demolition, it sounds like, and some construction. And before we do those actions, have we had an asbestos survey, as is required, at least in the private sector, by law?
And with your approval, I'd like to speak with Mr. Koutsaratis and his team tomorrow. I'll make sure that we get word, and we will get with each of you tomorrow to give you a very specific update as to where we are.
That would be a good course of action. And I know that we are allowed to inspect our own and issue permits as the state law allows. My question is, are we obliged to follow the rules when it comes to asbestos surveys? So that might be one for Mr. McGinnis.
Right.
We have to follow those rules, absolutely.
Okay.
But if you'll let Mr. Chambers do what he suggested, I think it'll be a matter of just deciding in the context, is there construction, is there demolition, what's going on, and what might trigger those things. So.
Okay.
In this first phase, we are not doing any demolition or construction. The only thing we have scheduled is painting of a room and replacing carpet, and that's maintenance and repairs.
Well, and the only thing to follow up, Mr. Koutsaratis, and I remember how it was at the school level, y'all always did this, that you'll check that book so that whatever we do, we know exactly what we're heading into before we do it. So
Absolutely.
we don't deal with the aftermath and the consequences of exposure.
And so that's right. So none of that's been done yet, and the only thing that's happened is we've taken some bookcases out of a room.
Okay, thanks.
All right, thank you, Mr. Koutsaratis, and thank you,
That's
Mr.
all
Chambers.
for me.
All right. Ms. Rush.
Nothing tonight.
All right, Mr. Bryant.
No, sir, nothing for me.
Okay. How about anything else, staff? Fill in Mr. Chambers and
Yes, sir.
Mr. McGinnis, anything? We're good? All right, meeting is adjourned.